from an African perspective.
And it's from the music to the culture all across the world, all across the globe, all from the heart of Africa. This is Africa World, our beautiful entry into the show, of course, with Dancha Mami Criolla with Nat Dios live in Lisbon. That concert, really appreciated it. Great start to the show, of course, as we bring you 60 minutes of the latest news, navigating the top stories from wherever you are. And it's from the African perspective, of course. As you know, this is Channel Africa. We do everything from that prism, the African perspective. We bring you the voices, the views, and the perspectives that matter. So let us know what your thoughts are. We'd really like to get to know where you're listening from, where you're watching from, what are the conversations that are shaping your world, what's happening in your community. Perhaps there are things that we're not covering that are of interest to us, and we just don't know they are of interest to us. Welcome to it. I am Tsipiso Makwetla. Reminder that you can stream live on the SABC Plus app. We are on channel 802 on the DSTV Audio bouquet, and of course we are to be found on OpenView channel 628. Well, let's get straight to it. Let's take a look at our top stories this hour. The acting leader of the Patriotic Front in Zambia, Given Lubinda, has appealed to the nation and its leadership to honor the late former President Edgar Lungu's final wishes. Speaking at a memorial service in South Africa's capital, Pretoria, Lubinda says Zambia should uphold the dignity he was denied in life and now in death. Kailihle Kumalo has more on this.
The acting president of the Patriotic Front, Given Lubinda, has lamented how former President Lungu was treated after leaving office. He recalled how his home was once surrounded by police and his gates broken down by officers who once saluted him as head of states. The Zambian diaspora expressed solidarity and agreed that Lungu's legacy must be respected and his memory preserved with dignity and fairness. Meanwhile, the Zambian government has appealed to people to refrain from inflammatory statements and hate speech pertaining to the funeral of the former president, saying this moment calls for unity, love and compassion.
And Kenya's Independent Policing Oversight Authority has launched a probe into the death of a 31-year-old Albert Ojwang in police custody. The death has sparked public outrage. Police, of course, claim that he suffered head injuries after hitting a cell wall, but his family lawyer disputes this. Protesters gathered outside of a Nairobi mortuary chanting, "Stop killing us." Channel Africa's Alex Carey has more.
A post-mortem is underway as we speak, right? Other issue is that the chief government pathologist had initially refused to take part in this post-mortem, but later on he was seemingly compelled to be part of it, although he's not leading the post-mortem. But so far the results indicate that beyond the injury on the head, there were bruises also on the hands, and we are waiting for a formal report in the evening. The family has also sent or posted 2 pathologists to be part of this, just like the government has also done so. So we have 4 experts who are involved in this autopsy.
South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa has expressed hope that they have a meaningful engagement with G7 countries, including President Donald Trump in Canada later this week. Ramaphosa will participate in the G7 Leaders Summit taking place in Kananaskis. Ramaphosa will use the time to engage world leaders regarding South Africa's G20 presidency taking place later this year.
So the G7 gives us an opportunity to go and propagate our message, the message about the presidency of South Africa of the G20 and how we want to see great outcomes out of the G20. And we're going to use it as a platform to begin to consolidate what we want to achieve in November when the Leaders Summit takes place here. So it's a great opportunity, and we're hoping that there will be good outcomes.
And economist, or rather, let's first start with South Africa's Health Minister, Dr. Aaron Motsoaledi, saying that there is no immediate concern for South Africa's following a COVID-19 surge in India. Speaking at the G20 Health Working Group meeting in Johannesburg, he's urged a continued caution as global leaders focus on pandemic preparedness.
All we are saying is that this is under surveillance. And if there's anything to be done, we'll inform the public. But for now, they must just keep on. Wash your hands, cover your cough, Stay at home, wear a mask if you think you have caught some flu. That's all that needs to be done for now.
And economist Tshepo Kgadima says Botswana's government lacks a clear macroeconomic policy and remains overly reliant on diamonds. The World Bank warns the country could breach its debt ceiling without cutting fiscal deficits. This follows $532 million in new loans from the ADB and Public Officers Pension Fund. Kgadima elaborates.
Things are going to look a lot more bleaker because these institutions tend to restrict the borrowers, such as the country of Botswana. And one is surprised as to why Botswana did not tap into the private capital through the bond market largely, because that would have given them some latitude in terms of how to diversify the economy. So right now I can't see them being able to diversify the economy.
And Nigeria and Aramco are struggling to finalize a record $5 billion oil-backed loan as falling crude prices rise, and concerns amongst banks saying the deal would be Nigeria's largest of its kind and Aramco's biggest financial move in the country. But the oil price drop may shrink its value. Innocent Samosa reports why.
Nigeria's President Bola Tinubu first broached the loan in November when he met with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in Riyadh at the Saudi African Summit. Details and progress of the loan talks have not been previously reported. The slow progress in discussions reflects the strain of the recent oil price drop, caused largely by the shift in OPEC Plus policy to regain market share rather than curtail supply.
Get the news, music, and lifestyle of Africa on Channel Africa, the African perspective. Africa World Hour. Africa World Hour. Unpacking global headlines from an African perspective.
And it's 8 minutes past 9. A very warm welcome to you. If you've only just tuned in, this is Africa World Hour. I am Tsipiso Magwetla. Remember to engage us on the social media platforms on X, TikTok, Instagram. At Channel Africa 1 is where you can find us. On Facebook, just simply Channel Africa. And if you'd like to send us an email, simply go to info@channelafrica.org. And of course, you can send us a WhatsApp voice note. That number is 063-406-9126. Well, let's start with some of our top stories this hour. Tensions flare in Los Angeles as the federal government deploys thousands of troops, including Marines, to quell violent immigration protests. The move, backed by President Donald Trump but opposed by California's leaders, has sparked a fierce political showdown between Washington and the state. Sharon Price Peace has more on this.
Police were seen pushing back and dispersing protesters who had gathered outside a federal detention center in Los Angeles Monday, where arrested undocumented immigrants had been held, at times using flashbangs and rubber bullets to disperse the crowd, with several arrests also made. And despite some pockets of violence, protests have largely been peaceful despite remaining tense, while pitting local and state officials against the federal government. Listen to LA Mayor Karen Bass.
We didn't need the National Guard. Why on earth? What are they going to do? Do you know what the National Guard is doing now? They are guarding two buildings. They're guarding the federal building here in downtown, and they're guarding the federal building in Westwood. That's what they're doing. So they need Marines on top of it? I don't understand that. That's why I feel like we are part of an experiment that we did not ask to be a part of.
California's Governor Gavin Newsom, a Democrat, called the federal deployment of Marines un-American after his state sued the Trump administration, claiming the president illegally federalized the National Guard and trampled on California's sovereignty. This was the first time since 1965 that a president has called up the National Guard to respond to civil unrest without first receiving an official request for assistance from the sitting governor of the state. In suing the federal government, California argues that the federal deployment violates the U.S. Constitution and exceeds the president's authority. Listen to the state's Attorney General, Rob Bonta.
The governor of California knows how to call in the National Guard if and when it's needed. He did it with the LA fires. He did it in the summer of 2020 with some of the protests in California. So this is something that is within Governor Newsom's sovereignty, and he did not authorize the use of the National Guard here, did not call for it. Yesterday afternoon, Governor Newsom actually sent a letter to Mr. Hegseth requesting that the secretary rescind the unlawful deployment of troops and return them to the governor's command. The request was ignored. We don't take lightly to the president abusing his authority and unlawfully mobilizing California National Guard troops.
President Trump defended his decision while attacking California's governor.
We have an incompetent governor, so I talked about governors, but I didn't talk about he's an incompetent governor. Look at the job he's doing in California. He's destroying one of our great states, and if I didn't get involved, if we didn't bring the Guard in, and we would bring more in if we needed it, because we have to make sure there's going to be law and order. You had a disaster happening, and they now admit it was a disaster. I watched the chief yesterday, who's a good man, by the way, and he said, well, we're lucky we did this because they were overwhelmed. You saw what was happening.
With concerns that deploying the military against Americans was simply adding fuel to the fire over federal sweeps seeking to arrest undocumented immigrants. LA Police Department Chief Jim McDonnell.
We're also aware of reports that the president intends or has deployed U.S. Marines to Los Angeles. The introduction of federal military personnel without direct coordination creates logistical challenges and risks confusion during critical incidents. Los Angeles Police Department, alongside our mutual aid partners, have decades of experience managing large-scale public demonstrations, and we remain confident in our ability to be able to do so professionally and effectively. To the public, we fully support your right to peacefully protest, but let me be absolutely clear. Those who choose to incite violence, engage in vandalism or graffiti, or attack officers will be arrested. There is no tolerance for criminal activity under the guise of protest.
Several anti-immigration and customs enforcement protests have also sprung up around the country, including in San Francisco, Atlanta, Dallas and New York, while the federal government has vowed to intensify its crackdown on undocumented immigrants nationwide. I'm Sherwin Bryce-Pease in New York.
And that brings the time to 13 minutes past 9. It's jump straight into one of our top stories today. We look at the war in Sudan and its impact on not only the economy but the people. It's pushed millions to the brink, with South Darfur among the hardest hit regions. A new report by Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders, Voices from South Darfur, details the violence, hunger and widespread insecurity facing civilians, particularly women and children. With us now, Kyle McNally, Humanitarian Affairs Advisor for MSF. He joins us to discuss the findings of the report and current humanitarian conditions and what can be done to address this. Kyle, very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us.
Good evening, and thanks for having me.
So we've been speaking to you and various UN agencies just about the impact of the conflict in the Sudan as a whole, and as of course what is happening in South Sudan, and there is convergence at some point. But just in terms of the number of displaced people, particularly women and children who are also fleeing various dangers, do we have current numbers?
Yes, this is one of the largest displacement crises in the world. You have more than 4 million people now who have crossed international borders, but you have more than 7 million who have been displaced within borders. It is the largest internal displacement crisis in the world and the largest displacement crisis writ large. And indeed, as you say, in these situations, it is the most vulnerable elements and segments of society, such as women and children, who suffer the most when in those circumstances.
And here we're talking about, and this is a sad fact, particularly when it comes to Darfur, continued sexual violence, which is used as a weapon of war, and there is raging malnutrition. What are the statistics?
We see staggering rates of sexual violence. And when we look at this, we see also some very concerning observations within the data. Not only do we have hundreds of survivors coming to clinic and coming for care since we opened services in the middle of last year, but what we notice is that we have high confidence that this is really just the tip of the iceberg. And we know that there's a lot of women who are unable to access care. We also know that despite the fact that the conflict has now been going on for more than 2 years, amongst the hundreds of survivors that we have now treated, we see more than 50% of those survivors have been attacked by a non-civilian. So that's a member of a military or a non-state armed group, a militia group. So a non-civilian armed actor that they've been attacked by. And also notably, more than 70% of survivors are coming within 72 hours, which means that this is something that is very much ongoing. This is not something that only occurred when the fighting in the front line was closer, but it still is ongoing today.
And not just ongoing. Again, I want to be historical about the fact that it's been ongoing through various conflicts in the Sudan. Is that not part of the problem, that while there has been reportage of these gross human rights violations, very little has been done in terms of protective measures when the fighting quells and building an infrastructure that makes sure that should it start again, that women and children are protected?
That's exactly right. This is something that has an unfortunate history, but it is something that is very much ongoing as well. And in the conversations that we have with survivors that have come into clinic, we also hear a real lack of confidence in whatever mechanisms for protection do exist or recourses to accountability. There's really not a lot of confidence in the formal mechanisms. There is a framework of cooperation between the United Nations and the government of Sudan, which can and should be implemented, which can promote greater accountability. But really on this point, survivors themselves must be included in this process and in these consultations to a much greater degree than they are today. It's the people who are impacted by this violence who should be consulted by the aid agencies and international actors when trying to promote greater accountability and prevent further abuse.
And what about safety and security at displacement camps or whatever shelters have been created to help those who are running away from the war, those particularly a lot of orphan children and a lot of men have been targeted throughout this war as well. So it means that there are a lot of, single-headed households led by women who themselves have nothing to protect their children with.
Indeed, and then this becomes part of the cycle of destitution and violence that we see communities now stuck in, because there is very little or no protection to speak of. In fact, in many instances, it is when people are moving that they report being the most insecure. This is when they're most vulnerable to attack, both men and women. Right. So this is a major issue when you think about being able to secure some kind of a livelihood or to plant or harvest in fields, which then, of course, has knock-on effects and impacts the already very dire malnutrition and food insecurity situation in the country. So indeed, it becomes part of this larger cycle of violence and destitution, which only exacerbates this preventable suffering and death.
And your report states something that is quite worrying, and I wonder what is the problem. So you're finding that even though NGOs are gradually scaling up their efforts and presence, UN agencies themselves, there's not much, adequate resources, but also presence that would help mitigate the circumstances, because you say they're still not on the ground in South Darfur.
That's right. The humanitarian response as a whole in the country has been completely inadequate and insufficient in a number of respects, and especially in places like Darfur and South Darfur. there's a lot of good reasons that this is very difficult. There's a lot of, in the first instance, we have to look at the responsibilities of the primary bearers of responsibility, the warring parties, the authorities, and those fighting this conflict at this stage, and the significant obstruction that has hampered the humanitarian response since the beginning, and still continues to slow things down 2 years later. That being said, indeed, we need to see much greater ingenuity and creativity and determination from UN agencies in a team.
Now, I want to...
haven't been able to 2 years later.
Sorry, Kyle, to interrupt you. Just said
please.
there was a gap there, so I thought you had actually stopped talking. So I want to look at your medical data, and I know you've done this work over, I think, a period of a year between January 2024 and March 2025. So there obviously is a lack of, generally speaking, health infrastructure. So tell us about how you're able to collect your data and what the difficulties have been in dispensing not only aid but medicines.
Yes. And bearing in mind that the conflict began April the year before, you see that the data window starts for us. And that's because we also were not able to reestablish services and programs in South Darfur until January of last year, and then really only through spring and summer being able to scale them to some degree. And that is where we're able to glean some of the observations from our medical data as a part of our medical activities and programs in places like Nyala Teaching Hospital, where we work alongside and with Ministry of Health counterparts who are working to try to get facilities like this back on their feet.
And the areas which are most affected, can you tell us which they are, particularly in South Darfur, and where are people able to flee to find help if they can at all?
Yeah, and this is also quite a difficult question to ask, because I think it's not so much attached to the areas, but it's where people are, right? And it's where people have fled. South Darfur happens to be one of the most populous states in the country before the conflict. It also is a place where many people who have been displaced from North Darfur, for example, have come to further south. So it's a place where many people have both remained, but also newly displaced have arrived. And so South Darfur is one of those places where you do have millions of people in need of assistance. It is possible to reach them, and yet the humanitarian response has not managed to get there at scale yet.
And I'm asking this because I'm reading some of the stories from Zara Abdallah, who lives in Al Salam camp, who was from the city of Nyala, and just seeing from the map that you've put out there's Nyala and Cass, and I'm not sure what the red dots, whether, okay, so this is where MSF activities are, and they are the MSF supported hospitals. But just in terms of the concentration of the fighting, how far are these areas, and how bad is it?
We don't see an active front line on the ground near South Darfur. Where we have teams, for example, and we have been struggling to work, and it's our French section of MSF France has been working in North Darfur, and this is where we're closer to some of the more active conflict. In places like South Darfur, the active front line has shifted away, both places to the north and also into the Kordofans. However, insecurity remains a concern because of things like airstrikes, which can be recurring and escalate at any time, but also because the kind of security vacuum that is left in its place when the front line moves on, and some kind of normal governance of security and law and order has not been restored.
And I don't want to just dwell on the bad stuff. I see that there are good stories coming out of this. Communities working together in solidarity, neighbors sharing food with one another. What more can you tell us about these encouraging stories?
Indeed, amidst these incredibly difficult circumstances, you also see individual stories of resilience every day. And you also see a solidarity network of communities that have come together and community that has joined together to ensure that they're trying to provide the support that people need. This is the means by which most people survive and get by on a day-to-day basis. It's the community-based organizations. It's the local partners. It's local organizations. And this is where the humanitarian sector and donors really need to refocus a lot of their attention in the coming period, especially in the context of significant aid cuts and Western divestment from the sector. We need to find ways of getting the money that still exists in the sector to the people, the frontline providers of care, to these local organizations who are actually those on the ground providing the services on a day-to-day basis.
And just a quick one. So it's not just food and medicinal resources that is required, is other things like teaching aids. I see that there are teachers who are actually working for free in looted buildings.
Indeed. You find community-based organizations and initiatives in many different sectors. However, they oftentimes don't have the capacity to register and meet the kind of administrative standards or requirements that you need in order to pull money from the pooled country fund, for example, as part of the coordinated response. And so this is where donors and the humanitarian sector needs to be much more flexible in loosening the criteria so these unregistered initiatives and organizations can more easily access the resources that exist.
Carl, thank you so much for speaking to us. Much appreciated. That there is Humanitarian Affairs Advisor for MSF, Carl McNally, speaking to us about the crises in Sudan, particularly focusing on a study that they've done in South Sudan. It is entitled Voices. So that brings the time to 27 minutes past 9.
África. Conhece o Ntivani? Claro que sou eu. Ntivani é o amante da música de corpo e alma. Eu amo música africana. Ele aprecia todos os tipos de melodias e passa os seus dias a ouvir a Channel Africa. Okay. Adivinha só, a Channel Africa quer ajudar o Ntivani e os amantes da música em todo o lado a descobrir ainda mais música incrível. Por isso, a Channel Africa está a convocar artistas africanos a submeterem as suas músicas. Músicos, lembrem-se de nos dar todas as informações relevantes no music@channelafrica.co.za. As submissões são a vossa oportunidade de ser ouvidos, mas não garantem inclusão na lista. Todas as submissões serão cuidadosamente analisadas para verificar se cumprem os requisitos da nossa estação. Canal África, a perspectiva africana.
Parlez-vous couramment le français? Êtes-vous passionné par la radio? Et êtes-vous qualifié pour travailler en Afrique du Sud? Envoyez-nous votre CV et vos 3 minutes démo en MP3 à @channelafrica.co.za pour avoir une chance de rejoindre la famille Channel Africa. Si vous n'avez pas de réponse après 14 jours, cela signifie que vous n'avez pas été retenu. Channel Africa, pas de réponse après 14 jours, cela signifie que vous n'avez pas été retenu. Channel Africa, la perspective africaine.
Channel Africa, where every moment is an African celebration. Feel the energy. Feel the connection. Channel Africa, the African perspective. Africa World Hour. Africa World Hour. Unpacking global headlines from an African perspective.
It's just about 21:30 Central African time. Welcome to it. I am Tshepiso Makwetla. This is indeed Africa World Hour. So we continue looking at conflict situations, but also looking at aid. And we look at it from this prism this time round. The United Nations facing a severe financial crisis that threatens its ability to operate effectively. As cost-cutting measures ripple through the organization, urgent questions emerge about the future of global cooperation. Daniel Forti, senior analyst for UN advocacy and research at the International Crisis Group, joins us now from New York to offer his expert perspective and advise on the causes, the consequences of the funding shortfall, and of course, what does it mean for international peace and security. A very good evening to you, Daniel. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us.
Thank you, Tsepiso. I'm happy to be here.
So let's just start with the lay of the land and how much money is missing from the UN budget. I was just recently at the World Health Assembly, and the WHO actually had a special session where countries sat down to look at the budget and how they can restructure the available funds. So just how bad is it?
Sure. The UN as an organization is going through a very difficult financial period for two primary reasons. The first is a multi-year liquidity crisis, which means that countries are not paying the amount that they owe the UN on time and in full amounts. This is largely the result of the United States being delayed on its payments, both for the UN's regular work and also its money to UN peacekeeping operations around the world at a magnitude of about $1.5 billion, as well as China, which is about $600 million behind schedule. This liquidity crisis over the past few years has led to job freezes and the UN halting programming, and this is essentially a cash flow problem. On top of that, there is now a structural financial crisis within the UN, which is because of the Trump administration's decision to pause, suspend, or review aid to many parts of the UN system, especially the humanitarian organizations, which has forced agencies like the WHO and UNICEF and the UN Commission on Refugees to put in place immediate cost-saving measures, cut staff, and review how much money they have to spend in the coming years. So in essence, the UN is facing a perfect storm of major financial problems that is forcing many countries to radically rethink how they engage in multilateral cooperation.
And not to unfairly criticize here, but I'd like to hear what your thoughts are, Daniel. If this perfect storm was not in the making for a very long time. I mean, for years, the questions have been asked about, if you look at where the United Nations is domiciled, it's in the United States. And we've seen in the past signs where if the United States does not agree with a particular type of stance that the UN is taking, funding would be something that would come to a head.
I think it is a fair criticism that much of the UN's voluntary work, which is mostly the humanitarian and development operations around the world, have for years depended overwhelmingly on US funding. I mean, some agencies rank anywhere from 20-40% of their budgets on the US. And, regardless of how impactful and helpful U.S. assistance may have been to these organizations delivering life-saving aid, it is understandable that such dependence on a single country can lead to such moments of volatility and potential crisis when that country decides to change its mind and withdraw funding. The other challenge, which I think is the one that is perhaps less expected but equally concerning, is if the U.S. is going to hold back or not pay its membership dues to the UN, which is essentially, the amount that the U.S. and all countries are obligated to pay. And the Trump administration has now either threatened to withhold or not pay much, if not at all, for much of its membership dues, and that creates a separate layer of financial problems.
And just understanding also the design of the payment systems in terms of membership and the cost thereof. You have the five veto-carrying members. Do they pay the largest share of the funds to the UN, as are member countries with less impact influence?
You're absolutely correct, Tsepiso. The five veto-wielding countries, so the U.S., China, the UK, France, and Russia, get the highest rate of membership fees. And then every other member of the UN, the 188 other members, have fees that are assessed according to a formula based on their economic weight and influence. So larger countries will pay more than smaller countries, but it is the P5 who pay the most out of anyone.
And you know what is interesting is seeing the fact that the U.S. has taken a front row seat in helping negotiate the end of the conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And yet I see here that the eastern part of the DRC, which is where, of course, the war really is, has actually taken the hardest hit in terms of the aid cuts.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think what we're seeing in Washington now is an approach to the UN that's not entirely in sync with itself. On the one hand, you have the officials in Washington who are leading on many of the budget proposals and budget decisions, who don't view the UN or the aid and development support or peace and security activities as a wise investment for American taxpayers. On the other hand, you have parts of the U.S. Foreign Service, those either working in the UN or based in embassies across the continent or the rest of the world, who still do see the role of American support and engagement. And oftentimes those goals between different parts of the U.S. system have not been entirely aligned, which is why we're in a situation now where some parts of the U.S. want to support either the UN peacekeeping mission or UN development activities, while others are prepared to get rid of the entire infrastructure.
And I see that USAID has been traditionally the DRC's largest humanitarian aid donor, and that has obviously really threw a lot of countries for a tailspin in terms of the amount of ODA cuts. There have also been cuts from other countries, but we actually have the UNAID's executive director who's coming to visit South Africa to talk about how they can restructure, look at opportunities for funding. Mm-hmm. How much wiggle room is there for a lot of countries? Because the question has been raised a lot of time, as I mentioned in the beginning, that why are countries seemingly caught off guard? And there have also been suggestions that now is the time for opportunity. But what happens in the meantime when all of that thinking is happening, when all of that remodeling is happening?
You're asking a lot of the questions now that diplomats here are asking in New York as the multilateral system is about to embark on this really difficult and soul-searching reform process. There's a lot of pressure on the UN system to cut costs as quickly as possible, whether that is merging different agencies, relocating staff to less expensive parts of the world, and reviewing those parts of its work that either are duplicate of other parts of the system or parts where maybe instead of going through a multilateral channel that there are individual countries can do this better. But, a lot of the talk is on the dollars and cents of it all and less about what goals do people actually want to achieve through multilateral cooperation, and what will the impact be on the civilians and citizens in all these places that depend on this aid. And unfortunately, we're not seeing clear strategy or direction at this point about, how the UN is going to handle this and what the countries who engage in this conversation ultimately want the UN to do. Right now, the phrase of the day in New York is the UN needs to do, more with less. But in reality, it's going to have to do less with less. And I don't think there's enough of a conversation yet that everyone understands what the consequences are going to be of doing less with less and how to position this whole system to still deliver and support the most vulnerable in the world about how to get through this.
And let's talk about the most vulnerable in the world. And in just a moment, we'll reflect on whether some interventions really do need money. I see that there's an NGO that's reporting that in some extreme cases that there are women and girls who, particularly in the DRC region, who are actually resorting to hiding during the day to avoid threats such as forced recruitment, exploitation, or physical harm, whereas in some cases, women and girls are finding themselves forced into sexual exploitation in order to get food or money to survive.
No, I've heard those criticisms before, and I can't speak to the individual circumstances that you're describing. But I think, the important part is that these factors, the impacts of these cuts, need to be taken first and foremost into account. It just can't be an exercise on paper and what's going into different governments' cost calculations for how to save money and how to justify that to their own taxpayers, because this entire system has been built in a way to provide support to people where their governments are unable or unwilling to. And, it goes against the values and the principles of the multilateral cooperation to end those programs and practices in a way that leaves them in more harm than is intended.
So I guess what I'm asking is that while the financial structure-based assessment continues, whether internally and externally, is the UN system looking at its resources, and are its interventions, all of them, just entirely monetary based? Can it still continue to offer some sort of aid without the money?
Absolutely, it still can. It depends on which parts of the system are engaged in certain parts of the world, and how much of a priority it is, unfortunately, politically for countries. In many cases, it's a matter of if the politics create conditions for them to provide that support, then they'll find a way to do so. Where we at Crisis Group are especially concerned is the so-called neglected conflicts where international attention is waning, but the vulnerabilities are still high. I mean, I'm thinking of cases such as Haiti or Afghanistan or even the DR Congo, where the political attention of powerful countries may not be on these situations day by day. And that's where we see the most volatility in terms of assistance and financial resources, both before this crisis and especially during this difficult period of transition. And these are the cases where often the UN and multilateral cooperation, it still provides a little bit of support, but that goes a much further way than in other places where the politics are stuck and international attention is high. But we're not seeing a case yet where the efficiency and impact of the aid itself are primary considerations for some of these budgetary decisions.
Has it had an impact on the UN's credibility in responding to global emergencies and crises? And I know there have been criticisms before about lack of accountability and fairness in some cases, but its inability to mobilize now, is it curtailing its credibility?
I mean, the UN is in a multi-year period of a credibility crisis at all levels, whether at the political level over its inability to stop wars in Gaza or Ukraine, at the operational level where the needs in many of the countries where the UN provides assistance actually far outpaces the amount of aid they can provide. So it's becoming a very difficult situation where, at moments when countries and people need the UN's assistance most, the conversations that people are hearing about the UN are downsizing, cost effectiveness, doing less, at a time when, whenever populations see the UN flag or the UN blue helmets, they expect protection and assistance. So, this credibility crisis can get worse in many places if the UN and its members are not focused on making sure that they can deliver as much as they can and communicate clearly what the changes are going to be.
Daniel, thank you so much for your time. Much appreciated your insights. Daniel Forti, Senior Analyst for UN Advocacy and Research at the International Crisis Group. It brings the time to 14 minutes to 10.
When the sun goes down, we don't stop the talk. Channel Africa, the best nighttime radio. Africa World Hour. Africa World Hour. Unpacking global headlines from an African perspective.
And we continue looking at some of the top stories across the continent. Thank you so much for being with us, staying with us as we navigate the day's top stories from an African perspective. And now we talk about the South Africa's Minister of Arts and Culture, Gayton McKenzie, reaffirming the government's commitment to repatriating ancestral and exile remains, announcing the second phase of the 5-year program targeting Angola, Lesotho, Zambia and Zimbabwe. Channel Africa's Michael Mbeu has more on that.
These initiatives, developed in collaboration with the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development and the Department of Military Veterans and Defense, focuses on addressing historical injustices by repatriating the remains of indigenous Khoi and San ancestors, as well as South Africans who died in exile during the anti-apartheid liberation struggle. Minister Mackenzie said planned technical missions to Angola, Lesotho, Zambia and Zimbabwe aimed at locating and documenting grave sites of South African exiles who passed away abroad will be undertaken while making a heartfelt public appeal to families, former comrades and communities to come forward with any information.
As part of the second phase of our 5-year repatriation program, launched in September 2024, a joint delegation of the people in the room will travel to Angola, Lesotho, Zambia, Zimbabwe. The mission will include inspection of cemetery records, grave mapping, historical and archival research. Most importantly, a call to the public is being made. We urge former exiles, comrades and families to assist us. If you have names, photos, dates or locations, no matter how small, please come forward. You can submit this information via the online form at www.sara.org.za.
In September last year, South Africa witnessed the return of the remains of over 40 liberation fighters who were buried in Zimbabwe and Zambia. Mackenzie says the second phase is a continuation from last year.
The Exile Repatriation Project Phase 2. As you know, last year we brought back Duma Nokwe, Bethel February, Memu Posho, Tot Machikitsa. We brought back 45 of our heroes. And that program is continuing with the instruction from the government that it should be sped up. Thousands of our people went into exile during the liberation struggle. Many never came home. Some died unknown, buried in unmarked graves, without their families having the chance to mourn. Why does this matter? The Exile Repatriation Project is about bringing our freedom fighters home.
In an emotional address, Minister Mackenzie recalled the painful trauma and suffering that these ancestors went through. About 58 of Khoisan remains are set for burial.
These ancestors were treated like objects and as objects. They were displayed in museums, studied in labs, and held in foreign institutions without consent or respect. We are correcting those injustices now. Key actions that we will be taking as the Government of National Unity, that we will have the reburial of 58 ancestral remains originating from the Northern Cape. This is being done in full consultation with the communities concerned. What this reburial truly means, it is not just about returning the remains to the soil, it is about restoring dignity, it's about fulfilling cultural and spiritual obligations, it's about healing the deep wounds of dispossession, and most importantly, historical erasure.
He also called for greater cooperation between stakeholders, nationally and internationally.
International cooperation. We are in active talks with the Hunterian Museum at the University of Glasgow to return more Khoi and San remains. Our people are all over the world, and this government is caring enough to say, go get the remains of our people. We call on all institutions, both here and abroad, to engage in honest and active-driven processes of restitution and repatriation.
South Africa's National Prosecuting Authority, NPA, is also playing a critical role through its Missing Persons Department. Madeleine Follard is a member of the NPA task team.
As the Missing Persons Task Team, we were set up to work on tracing the fate and whereabouts of people who disappeared in political circumstances. And amongst them are people who went into exile and never returned home. Some may have died in exile, others might have died while operating inside South Africa. So our team brings together two capacities, a forensic capacity by using forensic anthropologists who specialize in the human skeleton, because we are talking about skeletonized remains at this point after 4 decades. And we also have a research and investigation component that links together with the forensic to try to identify viable excavation sites.
James Mapanka, coordinator of the Reparation and Reburial Task Team, has acknowledged the community's concern over the absence of names of the ancestors. However, he has urged communities to proceed with their burials emphasizing the importance of restoring dignity over the need for identified names.
You see, the unfortunate part of this reburial, we can't attach names to the human remains, but we know for sure that it comes from Namakwa Korana people. So what we've decided as a task team, let's embrace as a Khoisan community, let's embrace these human remains and own them as our ancestors and bury them in a dignified way, even if we don't have the names.
Michael Mbewe, Channel Africa News, Johannesburg.
And at 10 minutes to 10, just a reminder that you are welcome to reach out to us. Let us know your thoughts about the program, some of the issues that you'd like us to cover. And of course, just tell us what's happening in your world. We'd like to be up to speed on what is happening in and around you so that we can put that African perspective to it, your perspective. Now, South Africa's Health Minister, Dr. Aaron Motsoaledi, says the pandemic agreement signed in Geneva marks a major step for global health and Africa, committing nations to better pandemic readiness. He spoke to Channel Africa's Tuto Ngobeni at the G20 Health Working Group in Johannesburg.
Everybody, especially on this continent, know what happened during COVID-19 pandemic in terms of resources, in terms of access to resources, access to treatment, and eventually access to vaccines. Only the most powerful, richest countries had that access. The poorest, especially on the African continent and elsewhere in the world, suffered. So after that, the World Health Organization decided that things cannot be just left like that, because COVID is not regarded as the only pandemic that was there and is going to pass, and there will be no other. There are going to be a series of pandemics, unfortunately, around the world. So they put together a team called the Intergovernmental Negotiating Body to negotiate what must happen if there's another pandemic, in terms of pandemic preparedness. That body has been negotiating for the past 3 years. Coincidentally, it was chaired by South Africa and France. Previously Netherlands, then they brought in France. And coincidentally, our former Director General of Health in South Africa, Professor Precious Matsotso, was the co-chair with the Ambassador of Global Health in France. They brought all these countries together. They've been negotiating for 3 years. Now this year at the World Health Assembly, the World Health Assembly is an annual gathering of all ministers of health, health experts, and related health institutions under the World Health Organization. We gather in Geneva every year in May. So this year was special because that negotiation that happened over 3 years was ready for countries to adopt. And the second significant thing is that this is, the World Organization was formed in 1948. Since its formation, this is only the second time that a treaty or agreement was made which is legally binding. The only other treaty since 1948 is the Framework Convention of Tobacco Control of around 2005-2002. It was supported by all countries to control tobacco around the world. Now this is the second one that's going to be legally binding. And it was adopted, but of course pending the finalization of what is called PAPS agreement, pathogen access and benefit sharing. Meaning what? A pathogen is the organism that causes diseases. Now, because these are infectious organisms, you find them in mostly poor settings, especially on the African continent. Now, companies and scientists used to move from the global north, the developed countries, come to Africa, take the pathogen, study it, and make a medicine or a vaccine, which Africa doesn't have access to. But the pathogen that led them to that medicine came from Africa. So pathogen access and benefit sharing means there's going to be an agreement finalized as part of this pandemic agreement, whereby if the pathogen is taken from your country, there must be a benefit that accrues from that. For instance, the proposal is 20%, that if a pharmaceutical company and its scientists get the pathogen from your country, go to produce a vaccine or some therapeutic product, they must give a 20% share, 10% which goes to World Health Organization to help poorer countries, and the other 10% to the country that has produced the pathogen. That is going to be finalized via what is called a PAPS annexure, which must be finalized so that next year in the World Health Assembly is fully adopted. And once that happens, it means parliaments around the world can ratify this treaty, this agreement. So it's a very big thing, it's not a small thing.
And are big countries in agreement? I mean, the large economies, are they in agreement with this, especially in terms of...
Well, look, that's why it took 3 years to negotiate. That's why it took 3 years. As to whether they are in agreement or not, you will make up your mind from the figures I'm going to give you. There were 135 countries that were eligible to vote in Geneva in May last month. There were 135 countries. 124 voted for. They voted for this pandemic agreement. And 11 did not vote against. They abstained. No country voted against. So up to so far, some of the countries that abstained complain that they are abstaining because the PAPS annex has not yet been finalized. They don't know what it has got in store for them. But the other 124 countries said, no, let's go on and then start looking at this annexure and see how we adopt it next year.
And Minister, let's talk about the new variant that has been detected across the world, the Nimbus. Is there reason to panic in South Africa? Are South Africans supposed to be panicking? And is the government ready to deal with this?
Well, first of all, nobody has ever dealt successfully with a pandemic by panicking. Let me get that clear. And because people usually get angry and say, no, but they are telling us not to panic, but and I stand up as a minister and say, oh, start panicking, there's a disease here. Nobody has ever solved the problem of diseases by not panicking. So the first thing you do when there is an emergency is never to panic, so that you can think carefully. If you understand what I mean, you can take deliberate steps. So I can confirm, yes, nobody ought to panic. But secondly, South Africa has got the NICD, the National Institute of Communicable Diseases. It's a world-class institution which has got a BSL-4 laboratory. BSL-4 laboratories, there are only 2 of them on the African continent. It is one in the NICD and one in Egypt. Yeah, it means biosafety laboratory level 4. In the other laboratories, it's level 1, 2, 3. Level 4 is the highest, and there are only 2. So we have got such an institution in South Africa. It is doing surveillance. It is checking these variants. It's an influenza season now. They are checking influenza. They are checking everything. I spoke to them yesterday, and they said we don't need any special public measure for now until further notice, until they tell us. They said all we need to do for now, because they haven't yet picked up anything. We know there are these reports from Asia, but for now. And they said all we need to do is to continue normal hygiene measures, which we take, like washing hands, hiding or protecting your cough, and making sure that you stay home if you think you caught a flu, or you put up a mask if you are going to walk in public. Those are the normal measures. Other than that, the NICD said there is nothing extra we need to do now, maybe until further notice.
And that there is South Africa's Health Minister, Dr. Aaron Motsoaledi, speaking about the groundbreaking Pandemic Act or agreement that was signed in Geneva at the World Health Assembly recently. Now, in May, he was speaking to Channel Africa's news reporter, Thuto Ngobeni. It brings the time just about 30 seconds to the end of the show. Shayla Ndugumana in the studio to tell us what's happening on Hotlines this evening. So what can we expect?
So today we're talking all things volunteering. You know that sub-Saharan Africa has quite over 70%, or rather the youth of the continent is over 70%. And so what do we do with all that energy? Right? How do we mobilize? How do we make our environment a better space? And so what I love about Volunteer Now, which is a platform, is that it connects you with organizations. And so you need not look and stretch any further. You just go into the platform, you register as a volunteer or as an NPO, and you begin to interact. And so we'll be finding out, of course, safety around that, because school children can volunteer as well through this platform. And so that will be the main focal point. But we'll also be finding out from people, do we still have that spirit to volunteer? Do we still want to give
that's what
back?
I'm thinking, because it's all very well having a platform, but
yeah.
You know, getting the people who actually want, people are just feeling so, you know, dispassionate and just completely forlorn, I think. So it takes a lot to think that you have nothing, but let me just take that nothing and go and volunteer. And it's a good thing. There's so much good that can be done with volunteerism.
Maybe this is the platform. You know, this is I suppose one of the very many that will speak out and encourage people to give of their own.
Well, let's hope they will. And that brings the time to 10:01. Thank you so much for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your viewing and listening here on Channel Africa. Hotlines up next with Shayla.
Hotlines bring you fresh perspectives about love after dark. With Shayla. Channel Africa, where